Actually, I think he's
And this. This one. Yeah, it's on. Good, thank you. I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask that we establish a quorum.
Buchanan.
Here.
Allen. Here. Dickinson. Here. Logue. Wagner.
Okay, today's hearing is going to focus on the subcontracting out of services. And while I'd like the primary, I know we will probably touch on some IT services, but I'd like the primary focus to be on the non-IT side of the budget, and we may well decide to have a second hearing that focuses on IT. But since the two are somewhat different, I think they each deserve their own hearing and their own focus. With that, though, I'd like to begin. We're going to have an overview, and we have Jim Butler, Harry Nanjo, Margarita Maldonado, and Dr. Stuart Bussey, if you'd like to come up and make your presentations.
Good morning. Jim Butler for the Department of General Services, representing the procurement function. I don't have opening comments, but I'm here today to address questions related to IT services contracting if they come up, and as well as reporting of all services contracting.
Okay. Henry.
Good afternoon. Henry Nanjo. I'm the Acting Deputy Director and Chief Counsel for Department of General Services, and I'm here to talk about the services contract and the review process the Office of Legal Services undertakes.
Hello, and I'm Margarita Maldonado with Service Employees International Union, Local 1000. We represent state employees, and we have been working on this issue for almost a decade, trying to figure out how do we resolve the issues around so much outsourcing and how that money is taken away from the budget, and is that really the right direction that we should be moving into for the state of California?
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Stuart Bussey, and I represent the AFSCME, UAPD Local 206, and AFSCME 2620, here to talk about some of the comparisons between civil service and contracting, give a little bit of history, and most importantly, offer some solutions to this.
Yeah, right. So Henry, could you walk us through
Sure.
the process that you go through to determine whether or not a service should be contracted out?
Sure, I can do that. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Buchanan, other members of the committee. Appreciate this opportunity to discuss the role of DGS in reviewing personal services contracts. I'll be speaking about, as I said, the DGS Office of Legal Services role with non-IT services contracts, and my comments will focus primarily on personal service contracts, which are agreements where personal services are a significant, separately identifiable element of the contract. And these typically include contracts such as those involving physical labor, as well as consulting, expert witnesses, and legal services. For the non-IT services, under California law, each state agency has independent authority to execute contracts if certain requirements are met. This differs from the commodity or information technology contracts, where the law vests in DGS the exclusive authority to contract for goods in IT, and then DGS can then delegate those goods and IT purchasing authority to other state agencies. Each state agency is responsible for its own personal services contracting, and this responsibility includes ensuring the necessity of services, securing the appropriate funding, complying with applicable laws and policies, and writing the contract in a manner that safeguards the state interests and obtaining required approvals. A threshold requirement for agencies wishing to contract out is to determine if there is a legal basis to outsource the services rather than having the services performed within civil service. The civil service mandate arises from Article 7 of the California Constitution and case law, and limited grounds for contracting out are set forth in Government Code Section 19130. Government Code Section 19130A allows for contracting out on the basis of cost savings if certain specified criteria are met. Subsection A is rarely used as a basis for contracting out state services. In Government Code Section 19130B, however, there are 10 grounds other than cost savings. I'll not list the 10 grounds, but they can be located within the code. And the most commonly ones that we see in our office are those services that are not available within civil service and cannot be performed satisfactorily by civil service employees, or 19130B3, or that are of highly specialized or technical nature that the necessary expert knowledge, experience, and ability are not available through civil services. That's still under B3. Also, we see a number of contracts under B10, which are the services which are urgent, temporary, and occasional in nature, such that the delay incumbent in their implementation under civil service would frustrate their very purpose. The State Personnel Board issues regulations to implement 19130, and the SPB has exclusive jurisdiction to decide challenges to contracting out under 19130. SPB regulations require that when contracting out for services, agencies must document the specified subsection of 19130 that supports the outsourcing, and that agencies must document detailed facts demonstrating how the subsection applies. Under California law, specifically Public Contracting Code 10295 and 10335, DGS is charged with reviewing and approving non-IT service contracts over $50,000. The law provides that contracts subject to DGS review are void unless and until approved by DGS. DGS reviews contracts for a variety of compliance issues, including adherence to competitive bid requirements and other statutory mandates, such as small business, disabled veteran participation programs, clarity of scope and budget, and inclusion of required contract terms, and then, of course, the documentation of 19130 authority. As part of its review process, DGS requires agencies to submit a contract transmittal seat, the standard 215. This form includes a section requiring agencies to document their 19130 grounds for contracting out, consistent with SPP regulatory requirements. Typically, during reviews, if the standard 215 does not contain a statutory reference and detailed facts, DGS will contact the contracting agency to obtain additional information under 19130. If the contracting agency provides adequate information, then DGS can move forward with approval. If the contracting agency provides inadequate information or cannot provide 19130 documentation, or there are other issues, then the DGS will return the contract to the agency unapproved. At that time, it's up to the department to resubmit the contract for approval when they have sufficient justification and information and made the appropriate corrections. On occasion, after conversations with DGS and return of the contract, a contracting agency may choose not to pursue the contract, in which case we will not see it again. Under the law and SPB regulations, unions may file challenges to personal services contracts at SPB. These hearings involve the contracting agency and the union initiating the challenge. SPB has the exclusive jurisdiction to conduct the hearings and render a decision as to whether the contracting out was authorized under Government Code Section 19130 or not. A further note is if a contract comes back, either another contract or an amendment, DGS will review those, and we will make sure that there's a sufficient 19130 justification. So every time a contract comes back to us, we will look at it and make sure that justification is there and present.
Okay, what I'm going to do is let all three of you speak, and then we can ask questions, because some of the questions we may want responses from more than one presenter. So.
Okay, great. So thank you for having this hearing and bringing this committee together to hear about this issue, and it is definitely important to how we move forward with especially the fiscal situation that we're in. And I also want to let you know that we're advocating transparency and accountability to make sure that we are looking and doing an apples-to-apples comparison of where those contracts are and how much money is truly being spent on outsourcing. And what I'll also be going over is our recent research, the hidden branch of government, and how many large corporations have a large chunk of money that is that the state is paying into. So I'll be going over that document. And then towards the end of the hearing, during the public comment, we have a few state workers who are going to highlight some of the additional problems that we see with state departments and contracting. I do want to start off, and with all due respect, I think that the previous speaker spoke to what the guidelines are and what DGS's role in ensuring that there is compliance with the law and that they are governing, they have the appropriate governance structure to ensure that the contracts are legally let. However, I can tell you we have an 80% win rate when we take the contracts to the State Personnel Board. That means that those contracts were not let legally. And so with that kind of win rate, it really calls into question how well those contracts were reviewed. I also want to say that in the last cycle, we were able to successfully pass AB 740, and that was signed by the legislature and also by the governor, which then required departments to ensure that the contracts weren't re-let after they had already been ruled illegal. And so we had to get legislation put into place to make sure that those loopholes were closed and that the contracts were not let again. So I just have to think that there's a flaw in that process, and from what I can tell, we have been one of the major, SEIU Local 1000 has been one of the major contributors in ensuring that the law has been upheld around these contracts. I also want to come and let you know that we have about 6 different recommendations that we think DGS can put into place that would where we could have a better procurement process. User-friendly reporting of the contract spending. Right now, they have a mechanism, and it's a database where information is present, but it's not user-friendly, meaning you can't go in and search it adequately in order to extract the right kind of information you need to make certain decisions as a policymaker. Better oversight of departments to ensure contracting provides value. We need to ensure that the departments where those contracts are led, that there is some oversight of those vendors. Today, we have not been able to see that there is a process where Department of General Services is training those departments to conduct that kind of oversight and to ensure that we're getting the kind of quality oversight from those vendors that's necessary. So who's really watching what they're doing? Restrictions on amendments to contracts. It's another big area. It really, we need to rein in those runaway costs. If you ever have an opportunity to go through some of these contracts, you'll see amendment after amendment, year after year. And that, if we don't rein that in, what kind of competitive process are we allowing to happen with these contracts if we're just continually amending them and not reevaluating as they should be? We also find that some departments, they have created a dependency with some of the vendors. So we believe that it's DGS's responsibility to prevent the monopolization, and this would require them to train and to monitor departments and what their procurement processes are. So they're providing a service to departments in order to help facilitate that monopoly. Better utilization of existing reports on consulting services. So DGS and the legislature should incorporate all of the existing reports that are out there and ensure that we have an improved oversight process. We have reports that the legislature receives. We have reports that the Bureau of State Audit that they have generated. We have reports that go to the governor's office. So who's actually looking at all of these reports and ensuring that we're capturing any kind of recommendations that could help improve the process going forward? And then there's another piece, and it's capping hourly amounts paid for consultants. And there have been some, the federal government has already added this as a portion, the way that they look at contracts. And so the different agencies within the federal government, there are some that do cap. How much? Because if you look at some of these contracts now and you look at some of the state employees paid, they could be anywhere from 3 to 6 to 7 times the amount. Is that really what we need to be spending for them? So with those 6 different areas, we think that we could help improve the procurement practices as they are right now, the way that we see them. What I'd like to do is go over portions of our document here, the hidden branch of government, and what we've been able to obtain from 2003 to today, that there's $210 billion worth of contracts with some of the larger companies around the nation, and that these same contracts they're repeatedly renewed. So they're not reevaluated to ensure that those services that they're rendering are sufficient, nor are they looking at are they the right vendor to be delivering those services, because they're just renewing them automatically. And then I also want to state that the sources that we have used to generate this report have been from different source information. Some of it being from the information that's kept by Department of General Services, and then others that we've just been keeping track over time. Our members have also brought us information, and so I just want to be clear that it's a compilation of a whole bunch of different sources that we've been able to put this together. And so it is also a concentration on those large corporations, and then the size. Everyone has an opinion of what the size of government should look like, but they don't take the consultants and those personnel services into account of what it takes to run California. And so we've been dissecting that, because that part is not as easily and as readily made available. So does it take 215,000 state employees to run the state of California, or does it take 300,000, because we're not really looking at how is California operating and who is helping it move. And then the other piece is that we, if we are just allowing someone else to run the business, how are we keeping track of that? How are they being held accountable? Right? Does California really have the kind of control that it thinks it should have, and what the operation should look like? So if you look at the first chart, number 1, and this is on the second page, if you turn it, you'll get an overview of what the expenses are. And so looking from 2008 to 2011, it's a $210.6 billion. California's overall budget during that same time period is $1.6 trillion. So you just imagine how much money in comparison is being spent on outsourcing. The whole contracts, and we have created some separation, the personnel services contracts alone, $130.6 billion. That's pretty significant. When we're talking, we've separated out what are those personnel services and what are the goods. So we've separated that portion out. And about 13% of all of the state expenditures during this time period, 13%, that's a pretty large amount, I believe. And just some research from many years ago, some people, that number should be significantly reduced. Is that the way we should be spending our dollars? I also want to draw attention to the table. And you'll notice here we have 25 vendors that are listed here. And these 25 vendors, and most of them are large corporations, but we would consider that to be who's who in corporate America as well. And you look at how much money the state of California has put out to these different vendors for different services that they're providing. In my mind, it's a pretty astonishing amount of money. And we have broken it down in this way because, once again, who has control of those services being offered to the citizens? And 64.4% of all of the money spent has gone to these 25 vendors. So that is also a pretty significant amount. The issue around the contract amendments and how some of these vendors have been able to secure those dollars, it is also highlighted here with how much money they continue to receive. The next chart is on the next page. And let me go back to that other thing. There used to be a provision where contracts could not be extended beyond the 30%. I don't know if it just went away. I don't know if it's just not being adhered to.
Could you explain what you mean by the 30%?
They could not be amended for more than 30% of the initial
change orders couldn't, okay.
Right. So for some reason, though, the contracts that we've been reviewing recently, there's nothing that's staying to those guidelines. And like I said, I don't know in what form they had to be adhered to that 30%, but it just raises a question that because we have some contracts that go well beyond the 30%. And so then moving on to chart number 2, it illustrates how the $10.8 billion in contract spending is concentrated in just around 800 of the contracts. So you see how that money is dispersed throughout, and 800 of them possess that amount of money, whereas the other near 11,000, they're only worth about $900 million. So you just an additional disparity on how much money is allocated to some of these contracts. So it's about $5.2 billion, or roughly 43% of all the personnel services contracts. It's spent on that is just spent on 13 of the contracts. So 13 contracts, $5.2 billion. So if you further dissect the information, you can see what kind of money is being allocated to some of these contracts. And conclusion around this document, and as the budget crisis persists, the state's obligated to even a greater accountability on how it spends the citizens' tax dollars. And the state sacrifices significant oversight whenever it extends contracts with private corporations without competitive bidding and regular evaluations for performance and evaluation and value. So I hope this document provides you with some insight as we've tried to dissect the information and see where those funds are being shifted to. And we really have, our goal is not that all of the money has to go back into state employees. But we want to make sure that the money that is being spent, and you can account for it, and that it's transparent of where it is. The other thing I want to also be clear about is that we are not totally against outsourcing. But when you look at these numbers and you see where the money is going, it really raises the question, do we need this additional branch of government to run California? And if we do need this additional branch, let's be really clear what it is and how long it has to be around in order to provide services to Californians.
Thank you. Mr. Bussey.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about some of the thoughts and solutions about contracting. And I've appreciated both prior speakers bringing up the fact of the government code and how a contract should be vetted, the appeals process, and Ms. Maldonado's presentation about certainly a large chunk of our tax money going to organizations which we really should be sequentially vetting on a yearly basis and not repetitively granting them extensions on large contracts. I want to give a quick historical background. As you all know, we've mushroomed into over 200,000 workers in our state, but when Governor Brown signed collective bargaining in the early 80s, we were able, as our unions were, to compete for good wages and pensions. But as this demands outpaced some of the services that we're demanding from that our citizens demand, we're spackling in the cracks with contractors. And when this practice of bidding and hiring that Ms. Maldonado has mentioned has become easier and more routine for state agencies, and as evidenced by the 80% win rate, you have to question this dynamic that some of these organizations are taking huge amounts of money, and they're becoming a very powerful force here. The allegiance for contractors even persists into the recent layoffs at our bargaining unit 16 dentists and our sister union bargaining unit 19 AFSCME local 2620. Our psychologists, dentists, and psychiatrists have been displaced by contractors. That's not in our contract. We specifically bargained for that not to happen. So it's a great concern. And while there should be some place for contractors in California, we think that civil servants are a better deal. We have a graph a little bit later I'll present. As the SEIU white paper implies, it's becoming an addictive behavior in California, subbing it out, contracting it out. I prefer to do things in-house. I've run my own private, besides being a worker here in California for the last 19 years, I try to do as much in my own private practice as I can and not sub it out. That's good business practice, and California should strive for that. But the agencies are like food addicts who choose short-term sweets and carbs. So I've got a little demonstration. This is what I feel is going on between a contractor and a civil servant. Civil servants are there, high protein, long-term, versus the sort of temporary fix that you get from a short-term carb. Government 19130 was created to limit these personal service contracts, but does it really work? And Mr. Nanjo mentioned that the fact that you do have the opportunity to appeal these, but in our MOU, for instance, we rarely get, and I mean rarely get, information about what contracts are going out. That's in our MOU too. It needs more enforcement. So one of the things we want to mention here in my solutions problem is to get more of a feedback loop coming between the agencies and our unions about what contracts are going where. We should be informed them. We should have the ability to appeal these. The cost savings, as I put in my paper, are kind of short-sighted. The agencies are taking salary savings realized from the attrition of civil servants, and they're using it to hire contractors. The permanent FTEs in civil service positions are vacant for years, and our recruitment efforts, which is one of the solutions I have listed, has got to be increased to get more permanent people in. The private agencies are more than willing to cut these red tape, and we've got this burgeoning market. So you would think without the financial costs, when we mention financial cost savings, that contractors are a good cost savings deal for the state. Well, maybe not. As we know, we had huge increases for our psychiatry positions and the contractors going down to ASH, taking 80% of the positions. There are 40 contract psychiatrists in ASH. And as our chart down there in the first attachment I have in there shows, if you match pound for pound a contractor psychiatrist in the 6th page, the average hourly cost, even if you factor in a civil servant pension, even if you factor in health benefits, we still are 29% cheaper than the contracts. We got $11.8 billion on the personal services side. That's got to be reduced. What's our budget deficit here in California? I'm maintaining this is one of the reasons that California is awash in red ink. We've got to do something about it. They're more expensive. Are they necessary? The state of California's procurement and recruitment system, Skippers. Okay. Now, Skippers, as we looked into our contracts, both 2620 and UAPD, we looked in our website, but I was very profoundly confused about the situation because The contracts are for the total amount. And so an agency will come on and they'll say, you know, give me $230,000 to service one institution. That's not necessarily going to happen in the next year, 2 years, or 4 years. There's a blanket allocation that comes out. And when we call the Skipper's website, we called the state procurement recruitment system last week, and we asked, are the amendments being taken out? For instance, the Department of Mental Health, we were totally confused that we had $910 million worth of open 2-year contracts, but we've only got $8.5 million that DMH took out. It's like it's a minute percentage of that. So it's not, doesn't give a real-time picture. Does not give a real-time picture to DGS, the agencies, the governor, or certainly the citizens on how their money is being allocated for these contracts. And while we're at it, I hope that these allocations, these huge allocations, don't influence any of the other decisions on where California spends its money, that they're mere allocations. So the other thing is the recording. Of 74 authorized DMH contracts in 2011, 33 or 45% were not recorded in Skippers at all. So this does not comply with Governor Brown's October executive order, which is the 5th attachment that says agencies and departments shall provide as much information as possible. Well, I think they've provided too much information, actually. We want to know exactly what's going out, what checks are being written. We don't know. We don't want to know what the long-term maximum is. We want to know what is going on as far as writing checks and what these contracts mean. Since these contracting agencies are required to file quarterly reports to each of our hospitals on their actual spending, we want to see those figures entered into Skippers. And so when we finally had to ask DMH for the individual contract data over 5,000, as the executive order states, they finally provided us only from the last 6 months of 2011. They were not even recorded at all, the individual disbursements from 2003 to 11. Okay, I want to bring up another troubling kind of liability that you might think of when you think of what a contracted employee could do to CalPERS, or what it could do to the state, more importantly. In fact, there's been lawsuits. In 2005, we have Nidegard versus Tri-Counties, where a doctor decided he wanted service credits. So he went to CalPERS after going as a full-time contractor for many years and said, hey, you know what? They didn't give me any service credits, and I showed up hours and hours a week. And so CalPERS, on the last attachment, has a certain, criteria for what a contracted employee is, what a civil servant employee is, and you know what? They granted him. They reclassified him as a civil servant and gave him back his credits. Now, think about Atascadero State Hospital, where we have 40 full-time contractors who've been at it for years. Can you imagine what kind of liability the state would have if they decided to reclassify themselves as far as back benefits or even employee retirement contributions? So I'll wind this up. The labor community has attempted periodically to pass legislation to curtail the proliferation of state contracted services. I feel a little more strongly than Ms. Maldonado about it. I think I think that the state should look within themselves and insource as much as possible, and try to capture some of this talent and some of the services that are in 19130, which is unavailable services. For instance, in the state, in the prison systems, or in some of our own hospitals, we could possibly get some of our doctors to become employees who provided these services. It would be better in the long run for patient care, continuity of care, and it would be cheaper. So today's hearing, I hope, signals a change. We're witnessing the same pressure nationally to keep the jobs at home and insource instead of outsource. So we want legislation, and the solutions that I said on the last page are as follows. One, strengthen GC 19130 and try to firm up these terms like emergencies, urgent, conflict of interest. Don't make it that easy to start contracting some of the jobs that could be done in-house. Two, we want to redirect some of the salary servings that we have when there's attrition going on or a hiring. There's a blank period of a couple of months where we want that money captured and go after some and hire some of the civil servants. I've got to believe there are people who are applying for the jobs in California and we want them to have hiring priority over contractors. 3, we want to specify clear and monetary manpower triggers that each department must demonstrate before they can go hire a contract, that they really are fall below a certain manpower mandate, or they have the money enough to do this. 4, we want to commit funds to improve the civil service hiring, as I said before, and we want to include rank and file if we want somebody that we know that can be a valuable asset to an organization. We want to have them bring their colleague over to consider being hired. And as the prior speakers have said, we want to reform the hiring process. So here's what when I came up here a few years ago, the first thing I noticed was nobody wants to go to places like Pelican Bay or out in the middle of the desert for some of these prisons. But as I've been president for the last 6 years of our union, I got more people telling me that is not true. We have people coming from very good, solid academic and practical backgrounds who want these jobs, who've heard about the jobs in California. Where are their applications going? Are they going under a pile? Are they going ahead of contractors? I want a more independent and objective hiring authority, and I'm thinking possibly maybe the front end of the State Personnel Board could do this, that you could do it and get them involved in vetting out whether there are people whether applications should be memorialized in some sort of escrow or website, that you know there are people who want this job, and not just say there's nobody that wants this job. I want somebody to prove that nobody wants this job, because I think they're out there. 6, institute greater scrutiny over field agencies hiring. Our dental departments got into, the DMH got into a bunch of trouble here as far as their deficit goes, and come to find out, all the spending and the hiring of people were going on in the satellite and field agencies. All the hospitals and the prison systems, some of the people out in the local areas are making decisions that are not being supervised and monitored to a great enough degree by the Sacramento head of the agencies in Sacramento. So I think we need more departmental scrutiny over what's going on in the field. 7, this is sort of a limit on how long you can be a contractor. Can you be a contractor forever? Do you re-up every year? Is it that easy to do it? How about some sort of sequential or time limit? How long can you be at the trough here doing this? I say there should be some limit. And after a statutory period, you ask the person, okay, you've been here enough. Do you want to come over to our side or not? For monetary reasons alone, I think there should be some sort of statutory limit on how long you can be a contractor. And then you got to make up your mind. If you work for the state, take advantage of the state, it's time to pay back the state at some point in time. We want to avoid any or misclassification litigation, as I mentioned before in the Niedergard case, by clarifying the terms and firming it up on what a contractor or state employee is. We want to, 9, provide greater enforcement and due process for the scenario I said before. In our MOUs, we really don't get the feedback on when contracts go out, even though it's in our MOU in Article 20. We want to know when these RFPs and IFBs are going out, and we want somebody to make sure that happens. And we want to streamline our ability to appeal, as Ms. Maldonado said. We want, lastly, constructive debate on what the rights of civil servants are to keep their jobs, to be protected, to keep the scope of their work protected, to keep it in-house. And in that respect, we have an public employee Bill of Rights that is on the venue this year in our legislature. So we'd like to see that pass. So basically, it's time for both labor management, the administration, all of us to get this budget deficit out, and for the legislators to step up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what I'd like to do is, let us hear any public comments first, and then we'll engage in member questions. So if there's anyone from the public who would like to say anything, you can either maybe use the mic at the end over here.
Get over here.
Hi, I'm Cindy Doyle, and I work at the Office of Technology Services, which you now call California Technology Agency, and I'm a business analyst. And I work for the engineering division, so we're the ones that actually go through and take and purchase most of all the hardware, software, and consulting services for the good portion of the entire data center. What I want to address to you today, and I appreciate Margarita's testimony, and stress the importance of our transparency. We have quite a few contracts that don't actually ever get seen by DGS because they'll put in multiple versions. They'll put in versions where they're under the certain dollar amount, and then they don't show up at all. So, and I want you guys to make note of that because I can actually prove how many times, because I have to see them, of how many times they put in the same types of reports or multiple years to actually have these consultants come in and actually do these contracts. Now, that was one of my major points I wanted to make sure I told you, but we have transparency. Yes?
Could you give a quick example of what you're talking about with respect to the contracts?
We have several different contracts that come through. We have one that actually is working with getting all of the agencies go over cloud services, and they have a choice because of the law that came into effect that said they have to be a Tier 3 data center or they have to come to us. And with that, we have consultants that actually have been contracted to come in and help with that project. They put it at $499,000, and the $500,000 mark is when it gets put over to DGS to be seen overall. And so now they've modified it a couple times. And I know I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, but anyway, but it's the facts. So, and I don't deal with anything but facts. So, do you need another? I'm happy to give you a lot.
I want an example of
we have transparencies that need to be done big time because we have this big lacking item that keeps coming up when we're spending our tax dollars. And I'll give you a perfect example. Last Friday, I had to sit with staff and actually with the union and save 22 jobs from being totally wiped out and put on our SROA list to be gone. And instead, we actually were able to actually put them in a different location. But at the same time, we have so many outsourcing items going on, and it makes me go, why? Why are we doing this? If we're actually robbing Peter to pay Paul, then what are we doing? So it makes you question a lot of things. We ask for transparency for when it comes to legislatures, when it comes to travel and related expenses, on all their elected and appointed officials. We have statements from economic interest. We have open records and meetings and laws that reflect this information. So one of the things that I had trouble with the other day, and I'm actually a certified Excel professional. I'm actually an expert listed in it from Microsoft. I took the test, and I went to DGS's website to actually go to this particular site to actually look at all the contracts. And I downloaded this stuff, and it's not friendly at all. And I put it in Excel, and I'm an expert. And I went through and I went, what are they trying to show me here? Because even I have to work with contracts and all the time. And I'm looking at it going, what are you trying to tell me? And I go through and I have to provide reports to our executives all the time, showing what we're spending our money on. So it makes me kind of question, what are we doing and why? We could probably make it a lot easier. And considering that we have so many service desks that actually have to support customers all throughout California, it makes me wonder, well, we need to be more user-friendly because then they can actually go through and look up the stuff themselves. In order to achieve things like this, there's probably different ways we could go about it. And we could probably make it so it's a little more user-friendly and has a little help area where they can actually go through and look at the stuff themselves and walk them through it. So it could save an astronomical amount of money on our budget if we actually go through and take a look at these things and have an option to be able to say, no, sorry, you can't, because that's important. And I hate the idea that we have so much hiring going on in one area and then the next minute we don't because we're ready to lay them off because what? We didn't transfer the information from the consultants over to the staff. We spent $99,000. I'm just going to give you one example and I'll be done. One example we have is we have SharePoint. It's a nice software product. Everybody can use it. We actually had it done a long time ago, and we're bringing in for someone from Microsoft for $99,000 for only 6 months. For that kind of money, you could have hired and actually brought in the entire staff who have to administer that particular product and trained them all in less than a month and a half for that kind of money. So My point is that there's lots of different ways we could actually spend our money, and I hate the idea of robbing Peter to pay Paul or taking staff and eliminating them in order to bring in a consultant. That just seems ridiculous. So I appreciate your time, and thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Sean Carey. I'm a licensed clinical social worker with the California Department of Corrections, Department of Adult Parole Operations, the Parole Outpatient Clinic. Like I said, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm here as a member of Local 2620. What we've seen in Local 2620, in fact, we've got many of our members right now that are facing layoffs in very specific areas, very specialized. In fact, at this very moment, we have one psychologist that's waiting to hear if he's possibly going to be able to save his job. And his specialty has to do with making sure that we're accountable for AB 1844 that is soon to become realized here on August 1st. And in his place, there was a contractor, and this contractor didn't meet the objectives that were required. And this contract for this one employee was $200,000 just for 50 clients, yet this particular psychologist sees many, many times more than that, effectively. Other savings for Local 2620 members. We looked at just CDCR alone, where we have psychologists and social workers filling a role. I understand that the role of contracting, one of it has to be a unique service, but just due to the numbers and to make sure that we were meeting the objectives of a lawsuit in CDCR, they hired contractors to fill a temporary void, and we understand that that's necessary from time to time. However, if we would have 2620 members fill those positions, we're looking at a $42 million savings of the $24 million in contracts that are currently in that position. With the tough times, it really is very important with folks losing their jobs to layoffs and furloughs that we look at the overinflated costs. The more specialized that the jobs become, for example, when you have psychologists that are trained specifically to meet the needs of AB 1844, it's a shame to let them go, to have contractors that bid and then can't even produce. So I would like, I couldn't say it any better than Ms. Maldonado and Dr. Busey has already stated. We need to relook at the way we do contracting in this state. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Howard Ballin. I'm an information systems analyst with the California Department of Justice. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to speak to you today. I want to say that the policy of departments that lay off staff and then continue their current outsourcing efforts or enter into new contracts is not proper, both from a policy and a physical perspective. I want to express my frustration that during the consolidation of state agencies, civil service staff will be laid off to achieve effective efficiencies, but so far no plans have been made public to achieve those savings through the reduction in contracted services. I believe that's because state workers' staffing levels and salary costs are transparently reported for each department in the state budget. Meanwhile, enormous sums are being spent on contracted services that go unreported year after year in the state budget. In the governor's budget, there is no separate line item for contract expenditures like those for state workers' staffing and costs. We need more transparency and accountability in the state budget process for contract expenditures. To give you a couple of examples, currently the state is consolidating services and departments under the newly forming Department of State Hospitals. Department of Mental Health is a major user of contracted services, particularly medical services. Current contracts for DMH amount to $388 million in personal services. But as part of these consolidation efforts and to achieve approximately $193 million in savings, DMH intends to lay up to 600 positions unless vacant positions are found. Meanwhile, DMH is paying much higher rates for TB testing, registry nurses, psychiatrists, and specialty care or non-routine medical care. Another example, DMH is looking to reduce staffing levels without the full knowledge of how much money is being spent on contractors. So how can DMH honestly identify what it takes to do the necessary work with the appropriate staffing and funding levels? We would like the legislature to look at departments like DMH who have layoff plans and encourage them to reduce outsourcing as a mitigation measure. In addition, they should consider other avenues other than reducing personnel, since personnel reductions can and often do result in further and more costly contracting out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wrote down the $388 million in contracts. What were the numbers you gave for layoffs?
To achieve a savings of $193 million, which is the equivalent to 600 positions.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy day to meet on what I consider a very important topic. My name is Marie Harder. I'm a Senior Information Systems Analyst for the Department of Public Health. I am also Vice Chair of Bargaining Unit 1, which represents 46,000 state employees. I'd like to try to wrap up what SEIU has been talking about this afternoon on things that we think would improve transparency and accountability and to achieve some savings for the state. On transparency, neither the legislature nor the public can really get a handle on the size of what we call the hidden branch of government without improving the transparency of the state spending on billions in contracts. I'd like to give you an example, if I could. You might look at the food stamp program. I believe it's now called SNAP. It was an eligibility worker many centuries ago. And you might see it as, you know, let's say a $300 million program, and you might see that there's X number of state employees. But what you are not seeing is how many contracts there are in that program which are delivering those benefits to the people of California. And if you don't know how many or how much those contracts are for and you want to do cuts, you don't know exactly where those cuts could be. So you may be cutting the services, but not cutting those contracts that are delivering the services. As a result, the people of California are shorted, but not the contractors delivering the services. And I think that would be a disservice to the people of California. We'd like to propose some ways that would help improve transparency. One would be budget control language, which would be very simple and would require departments to report annual contract spending as a part of the submission of their annual budget, proposed budget. That could be made a requirement, of course, in the budget control language. Legislation could adopt, you could adopt legislation that requires departments to report their contract spending as part of their budget submittals. For larger contracts above some minimum value, such as $500,000, legislation might require the reporting of the following elements: the name of the contractor or subcontractor, the length of the contract and the services provided, the total cost of the contract for the prior year, projected number of private contracts and the estimated contract costs, the number of employees and consultants. We heard earlier that we often, there's a need to contract on a temporary basis. Most of the time temporary is considered 9 months out of any 12-month period, yet we have many contracts that go year after year. And I know in my department we have some contractors who have been on staff for 10 years, but they're justified under temporary basis, which doesn't really make sense. We need a searchable database in order to look at these. You know, when we say transparency, it means that you or I or Mr. and Mrs. public should be able to look at something and get information. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at the Skipper's database, but if you have, God bless you, because you would find it very difficult to figure out what that information is and what it really means. You don't know if things are repeated twice. You don't know exactly for the time period involved. It is very difficult to get it, to separate it. I have spent days going over just one period of that data to get anything that I could really use out of it. A little bit about accountability. I think that we all want to get something of value for what we contract for. But I'm not convinced, and I don't think anybody in SEIU is convinced, that either DGS or the departments to which it has delegated its purchasing authority have allocated sufficient resources to oversee contracts once they have been let. Improving accountability means better project and contract management, more competitive bidding, and fewer monopolies. I can't tell you how often I have seen us pay contractors to do the same thing again and again and again. That's not getting value for our dollar. Better project management and honest status reporting on the state's part might avert spectacular cost overruns, such as we have on IT projects at Administrative Office of the Courts, CalPERS, EDD, and the State Controller's Office. When we get status reports, I got to tell you, they are very sanitized because the departments take the attitude, we cannot point fingers at anybody. So we're not going to be really truthful on what's wrong with the projects. We need more competitive bidding and fewer monopolies. If one of DGS's responsibilities is to ensure competitive bidding as a way of lowering costs to the state, how does the agency justify what we have found to be enormous concentration of contract dollars among a small group of corporate vendors with frequent contract extensions? I came across a Polaroid contract by DMV, and it started out, I believe, at something like $700,000 in the 80s. It had been amended 10 times. It was up to $12 million. And I got to tell you, digital photography has come into being. There might be better ways to do it. Make you look better, too. Okay? When 64.4% of the total dollar value of all personal service contracts is spent on the top 25 vendors, it's hard to imagine how DGS is really successful at promoting small business. This is a recipe for creating state monopolies, and we all know what happens to customers, services, and costs when a line of business fails under the control of a monopoly. We also have to look and assign some responsibility to the Department of Finance because they find it easier to grant contract dollars to departments than to approve positions. And if you look, I'm sure all of you are involved in the budget, and every department, they equate their savings or their costs by state positions, even though contract dollars equate to contract positions. We can achieve savings by utilizing state staff. Master service agreements for IT consultants show bill rates 2 or 3 times the cost for state employees. Privatized prison services are costing billions in long-term contracts with private prison operators at a time when realignment should mean lower prison populations and a decreased reliance on these operators. Their contracts should be cut before state workers are laid off. Medical services, similarly, as the Department of State Hospitals is set up, The efficiencies achieved by consolidating medical services previously provided under separate departments should mean cuts to contracted services before any state staff is laid off. I want to go back to say, we know there's a deficit. We know you need to make some cuts, but you need to know where you're making cuts. And unless you can see where contract dollars are, you're not going to know where you're really cutting services and leaving contract dollars alone. And I personally think that you should know that.
Could I ask you to wrap it up so we can let some other...
I also think that you should know that many of our contractors that we use are former state employees. They're already vested in CalPERS. They're already receiving their retirement. They're already receiving their health care from the state of California. We also have billions of dollars that are going in interagency agreements to our college and university service, our colleges and universities here in California, and that's being done basically unchecked. State Personnel Board will not look at any challenges with those. These colleges and universities are very much in their own business. They will turn around and contract out because they don't need to follow the requirements of Government Code 19130. So they contract a lot. We also do a lot of subvention to local agencies, and there's pretty much no oversight of those because nobody has enough staff to do it. That's all I have to say.
Okay,
again, as you can see, there's a lot of money switching hands, and I think that it's there's so much money involved in that it's a really good place to start looking on how to reduce the deficit. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to testify? Okay, then I'd like to open it up for member questions or comments. I know I have quite a few, but I'm happy to. So, Member Dickinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the testimony this afternoon, all of it actually. I had a couple of questions, Mr. Nanjo, that I wanted to follow up on, and a common theme seems to be the difficulty of understanding what the program is currently with regard to reporting contracts, the ability to monitor for the public what's happening with respect to contracts that are entered into by departments. So I'm interested in whether, hearing the commonality of that refrain, the Department of General Services is currently expending or would expect to expend some energy on trying to make the system more user-friendly and more transparent.
You're talking, Assemblymember Dixon, of the Skippers program. That's actually run out of our procurement division.
Okay, we'll let Mr. Butler take that one then.
Sure. So, yes, I have heard that refrain and agree in general that it is not a great system. It's a very old system, and the data is very poor. So the efforts that the state has been putting into improving that have been actually, quite intense. As you know, the Financial Information System for California initiative was, the direction to the administration to pursue that initiative was put into law some years ago. And the Departments of Finance, General Services, the State Controller's Office, and the Treasurer have been collaborating on that project. And one of the key items that would be delivered by that project is enhanced reporting. Not only...
Are you referring to Fiscal?
Yes, sir, I am.
So just, if I may interject here, you're not going to tell us we have to wait for Fiscal to be perfected before we can improve the information available on contracts, are you?
No, I think improvements can be made in the short term, but I believe in terms of the state's resources, how we would invest in delivering a truly world-class reporting system, that the best approach would be through the Fiscal initiative. There are things that we can do to the current system to improve it. I'll be happy to attempt to collaborate with anyone who's got input for us on how to improve that. So one of the things that I heard people are having a hard time with is this notion that amendments look like they're being duplicated, so therefore you're getting double counting. That may be some of what's causing these very, very large numbers. So if you have a contract for $100 million and it gets amended to change the name of the contractor, that gets reported as a change to a $100 million contract, and now all of a sudden it looks like a $200 million contract. Those are the kinds of things that we can work on in the short term. But as I said, a very, very world-class kind of reporting system that would expose that to the web, make it easily searchable, and be very rich with data. We don't have the resources to go and create that 2 and 3 and 4 times, especially given that the Fiscal project has that as one of its major deliverables.
There's been some considerable effort, obviously, expended to try to calculate what's being committed and spent in contract dollars. If today this committee asked you to come back in a week and tell us whether this is accurate or not and give us an accounting of your own, could you do that?
Well, I couldn't deliver certainty as you would get from a public accounting firm. I could certainly offer my observations. The requirement to use the SKIPR system, the State Contract Procurement Registration System, is at the level of DGS policy. There's no law that requires agencies to do that. Agencies comply with that. In some cases, very, very well. You'll see some agencies that put absolutely every transaction in. There are others who don't put very much at all, and we continue to work with them and educate them and request that they do so, but we have no authority to in any way penalize them for not doing so. As well as that system doesn't, the current DGS policy does not require transactions less than $5,000 to be put in, just due to the manpower, the labor-intensive nature of doing so for a very large department like corrections, who may have literally tens of thousands of transactions like that a year and not have the resources. They would have to decide, are we going to put information into the system, or are we going to staff our prison facilities? Those are the kinds of trade-offs that they're making.
I must say it's hard for me to believe, and maybe it's just my simple little local government background that raises its experience here, but that we don't have a system that tracks contracts that isn't easily accessible and easy to understand.
My guess is your local government system was probably far superior to what we have here in the state of California.
Well, I don't know whether that's true or not. I've just the objective here seems to me to be a system that tracks what we're doing and people can use it without a degree in computer science.
Well, that's one of the again, and I'm not trying to drone on here about Fiscal, but one of the issues that you have is you have 200 different 200 different entities that run their own financial system. They have their own accounting systems. These are all different state departments. One of the great benefits of Fiscal is to put them on the same system so that when you cut a purchase order, that information is in there once, and it gets replicated throughout the whole system, and you can use it not just for reporting procurement, but for budgeting and for accounting and everything else. And until we break down those walls and create a single system, we're going to struggle with this issue.
I'd like to ask questions just a couple other areas, if I may. We heard testimony that 80% of the contracts that are challenged in front of the SPB are in fact overturned or voided. I'm curious, either one of you, can you enlighten us as to how many contracts, on a percentage basis, DGS looks at and sends back to the department saying, no, you have not met the statutory criteria for contracting out?
I don't have exact numbers, but with the services contracts, Office of Legal Services does send quite a bit of a number of the 19130s contracts back, contracts involving 19130 issues back for further information. A lot of departments aren't real good about putting a lot of detailed information when we first get it, so a lot of times we'll have to contact them and get further information. But not to kind of draw perspective to it, I just had staff, we don't have a real good, we don't keep track of every single contract comes in, whether it's a 19130B or not, but I had them kind of take a sampling, and probably they looked over somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's see, what did they say? I think it was close to, there it is, probably in the neighborhood of 21,000 contracts, and of those, less than 1,000 had 19130 issues. 19130B issues. So that's kind of the scale that we're talking about. It's not a large percentage of the contracts that DGS gets. The other issue that I need to point out too is we can ask. We don't draft the contracts. And on the services side, DGS reviews the contract that's already been let and executed by the contracting agencies. So a lot of times when we're talking about 19130 issues, they provide us a justification. We don't really have a mechanism to go back and double check their facts. We have to take their justifications most of the time at face value. So consequently, if their facts turn out to be not as it was represented to us, then that would account for it being overturned at SPB, depending on what facts ultimately come out at hearing.
So, Mr. Nanjo, are you saying that you're not provided or don't have the capability because you don't have it independently, you're not providing the information or have the ability independently to develop it to sufficiently and adequately review these contracts to see if they comply with the statute?
We take great diligence in reviewing these contracts, but my comment is we are relying on the information that's provided to us by the contracting agency. So to the extent that they provide us the right answers, they provide us a justification that meets the code, we don't have a basis to say, well, are you sure about that? Let me, a lot of times we'll ask for supporting documentation, but we have, in the Office of Legal Services, we review approximately 7,500 contracts a year. This is not the only thing my staff does. We have other functions as well, and our commitment that we've tried to make to our contracting agencies is 10 days to review them from dropped off at our door to back out to the agency. So we do the best job we can with the resources we have, but we don't have an investigatory function is what I'm saying. We don't have independent investigators or independent auditors that go out on a regular basis and check these for compliance with what they've told us.
I mean, given what you've said, Dr. Busey, I'll let you have a comment in just a moment, but given what you've said, one might reasonably wonder whether there's any meaningful review occurring or not, because I suspect that it takes one rejection before a department figures out what they got to put in to make sure it gets past the review.
I respectfully disagree with that, because there are situations where a contracting agency has realized that their contract is probably not going to prevail, because one of the things that we will point out to them is all it takes is a union challenge. You're going to be in front of the SPB on this. So I mean, we try to work with the agencies to have them do the right thing.
Dr. Busey, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to put some of the light on the contracting agencies. When we called EMH up recently and asked why these gigantic numbers, $910 million, which are obviously not what they're putting out, we got sort of an explanation, and I don't have a person I can ascribe it to, but what they said was because the department is unsure of any of these companies' ability to come through with a psychiatrist, they execute many contracts with the same number to cover themselves. So you're probably getting 303,000, 303,000. Many. This is possibly one of the reasons these numbers are high. And I would suggest I'm going to take the heat off of you for not doing this, but let's put it on the agencies. If somebody comes through with a contract and they put the psychiatrist out, can they call them up and say, we want to amend it now? Company A has provided these psychiatrists, and that's all we're going to need. This thing seems to accrete and become this gigantic balloon here because of the duplicative nature, the insecurity of a contractor to come through and provide the services. And maybe some of the light should be on forcing or mandating that the agencies have some statutory period to check in with you guys and say what the real-time amendments are. I don't know, what your review process is, but if you're only getting 1,000 of 21,000 government codes, somebody's not communicating with somebody. So I want to just put some of the light on the responsibility on the contracting agencies to call these guys up and say we filled it, forget these other duplicative contracts, and amend it, because we don't know where we're flying. We don't have real-time data. I agree with you.
Does the department indicate when it signs off on a contract the statutory basis for approval?
I'm sorry, Assemblyperson?
When the department signs off on a contract or approves a contract, does it indicate the statutory basis for the approval? For example, it's a temporary or an emergency situation, or it's a service not available.
Sure.
Those categories.
That's part of the form that we originally get from the department. The cover sheet, the standard 215, says these are contracted out services. It has to give the code section, and they have to provide the justification. There is a place for it on the form. Obviously attach additional sheets as necessary. So when we approve a contract, it's going to be on the basis that's on the 215. Unless there's been a change, in which case we'll have them file an amended 215.
Okay. And given your previous answer, it sounds like mostly that's a check-the-box kind of review.
From the 215 standpoint, it's checking the box as to which exemption it is, but then there's the details. And then at OLS, what we do is contracts are reviewed depending on the amount. If they're under, I believe, $250,000, they go to one attorney. If they're over $250,000, they have to go to the contract value total. It has to go to 2 levels of attorneys. So there's a first level review where they check to make sure it meets all the requirements. They check the 19130 justification, get that to their satisfaction, then it goes to second level to make sure that those things are made and are appropriately checked as well.
One last area I'd like to inquire about is the amendment of contracts. If I read the material correctly that we've been provided, contracts should not typically have a operative period of longer than 36 months. Is that right?
That's correct.
So a max 3-year contract, and it should be rebid after that point in time.
Correct.
So my question is, first of all, do you agree with the testimony that we've had that contracts have been amended on a repeated basis? And if you do you consider that a circumvention of that 3-year limit on the length of contracts?
When contracts come back, if they're going beyond the 3 years, then they're treated as a new contract. They have to have the justification for they have to either be competitively bid out, or they have to have a justification for it being non-competitively bid. There's a whole process that DGS has to, if a contract's going to be non-competitively bid, to go through that and to get that approvals. In some cases goes up as high as our director. Under prior administrations, it's gone as high as the agency secretary to approve non-competitively bid contracts. But each time that contract comes back, whether it's just by an amendment or a new contract with the same contractor, it's treated as a new contract and has to meet all those justifications and have complete background and support for it, including the fact that it's being relet to the same contractor.
So I'm a little unclear on this. How could you amend a contract if you require competitive bidding? You'd have a new contract, wouldn't you?
If that's the case. In some unusual cases, there is a process by which a contracting agency could make a justification for whatever reason that this contract should not be rebid.
Would it be effectively a sole source
Correct.
justification?
Correct.
So each time these come back for an amendment, someone reviews it and says it's not practical, feasible, or otherwise possible to go out and rebid this competitively. We've got to amend it because of sole source justification?
Right. And a typical example of something like that would be if there's only one vendor who could provide a particular service, there is no one other, maybe servicing a proprietary piece of equipment or something to that effect, then that's the situation where a sole source may be considered. And that's where a situation could go beyond those 3 years.
Yeah. One would expect that to be the exception rather than the rule.
Very exceptional, yes.
Do you track that at all?
Yeah, we do. We have the data related to the number of requests we get for non-competitively bid contracts, and we trend it over time, and the trend is down dramatically over the last 10 years. So we have that information. We'd be happy to provide it.
You could provide that to us?
Yes.
Assemblymember Wagner.
See that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panelists. I appreciated the presentation. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to start really with this report from SEIU and ask about a couple of the points that are in here. If I understood, Ms. Maldonado, the roughly $210 billion in contract expenditures was right about 13%.
Personnel services, yes. Personnel services.
Well, personnel services is 130.6 billion. The 210 is
all.
Okay, so that's the whole. That's roughly 13. I haven't done the math.
Right. So the 13% is what makes up the 210.
Right.
Billion.
Okay. That's what I thought. Now, typically in an organization, roughly 80% of the cost is employee cost. Maybe it's 75, maybe it's 85, but 80 is a rough hand number. Do you have a problem with that number? Do you disagree with that?
I have a problem with the way these contract dollars are spent. So I can't really speak to what your direct question is about the 80% payroll. What part of it should be what portion?
Well, that's where I'm going. I haven't asked that question yet. I just want to make sure that the premise of my question is right. That we're looking at roughly 80% of our budget goes to employee costs. Is that a fair number?
I got to understand the context in which you're asking it, because if we're looking at the $1.6 trillion over this 8-year period, are you saying that 80% of the budget of that 1.6 trillion budget is employee costs?
That is a thumbnail number. I think that's an average number for organizations.
I think you're talking about the entire budget of an organization, right?
I am indeed. Combined budget expenditures.
Which is the 1.6 trillion.
Which is the 1.6 trillion.
And so you believe that 80% of that amount is
I'm trying to get a cost at employee costs to the state of the 1.6.
Yeah. I don't have if it's 80%, if the 1.6 trillion is 80%. Employee
that's fair. Is there anyone who has got a sense of what that number is? Because it's typically about 80% in an organization.
Yeah.
No. All right. Well, then let me. Okay. Well, if you don't have that number, I'm a little troubled by your position. Then that the 13% that is here is too much. If we don't know what we're comparing it to, where do we come up with the idea that the 13% of the 1.6 is too much if we don't know what the other component is?
And I think your argument speaks so much to why we need transparency, right? Because we need to be able to see how those dollars are being expended. So you're absolutely correct that
Thank you.
We have coupled this information together off of the information we've been able to gather that the state of California is maintaining, and we need additional information.
I appreciate that, but if 13 is not the right number, what is the right number, and how do you come to the conclusion as to, number one, what that right number is, and number two, that 13 is the wrong number?
I think it's very simple to say that 13% is wrong because of the way that those dollars are currently being expended. Now, if it is the state's position that we want to have a certain workforce that's not calculated into what it costs the state of California to do business, then the state has the opportunity to do that. But when we look at employee cost, which are state employees like myself and like the members who spoke, there is a certain dollar amount that's attached to that. Now there is this additional a dollar amount of personnel services that are also another way of delivering services. So, I really think that we need to get down to what does it cost to run the state of California, and what's the right direction we need to move into to make sure we're maximizing those dollars. And because we don't have it broken down, and this is putting together with the best information we have, right? We can't necessarily do that.
I think you and I would be in agreement that what we want to do is get basically the best bang for our buck.
Right.
Spend the dollar on employee costs in the most appropriate manner. I guess I was just a little curious that 13% is the wrong number. Now, if there is transparency, let's say we have all the transparency in the world, and things are great in the contracting out world, then maybe 13% would be too low a number. So we don't know.
We don't know. But remember, and respectfully, we also have to look at the other components, is that if we're not providing the kind of oversight that's necessary to ensure that those dollars are being spent the way they should be without having the oversight over those vendors, then how are you to say yes or no that that's the right way that we should be moving, and that's the direction that California needs to go. So.
In the state right now, unemployment is a little over 11%. Let's use 2008 as a base year. It was sort of the last good year. Do you have any idea what percentage SEIU employment is down this year over 2008, using that as a high water mark?
Since 2000, for 2012, or would it be for 2011?
Whatever the most recent figures you have.
I don't have a percentage. I can tell you that at the end of 2011, December 31st, we lost about 1,000 employees from the State Compensation Insurance Fund. We are slated to lose another 300 or 400 from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. We have lost a few dozen employees from the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. I can give you some anecdotal information about where the reductions in workforce have come in different departments. I also want to let you know we represent 95,000 of the state employees who do a wide range of the work. So some of those positions are very critical positions. So even if they would have, a vacancy would have been created because of the nature of the job that they would do, they would have to fill that position. But I can't give you an exact percentage. Is there something more you were looking for around that? Is it how it relates to the unemployment?
Is it anywhere close to 11%?
Yeah, I can't tell you if it's that amount. I can just give you those numbers that I just pointed out to you.
Mr. Busey, might you know for Asks Me those numbers?
I don't know what 2620 is. I know our dentists and doctors are being laid off, and I just think the larger issue is not how many of the more important issue is reducing the deficit of the state and creating, as we're all saying, the best bang for the buck is. And when contractors are still, when our union had to go from institution to institution to literally extricate contractors who were occupying this position, as I showed you on those numbers, they're 29% more expensive for whatever people that we lose. They should be going first. They're more expensive. They have a higher lower learning curve. They're not more efficient. So I think we're here to talk about contractors, and they should be on the chopping block first. So I don't know the numbers as far as what. We are losing dentists, doctors, and psychiatrists in our unit. 2620, I think the gentleman talked before, has been hit worse.
Right. Okay. And again, turning back to the SEIU report, we're told here Corrections Corporation of America spent $1.5 million on lobbying in that time span, and I think that time span is 1999 through 2010, correct?
I just want to verify that. These are more recent. So it's
Okay.
2010.
What time span? Because the only time span listed in here is 1999 to 2010, and I checked the footnotes, and you don't give me a time span there either.
So we could get back to you.
I would be
We
curious.
could get back to you on that.
Would you please? And do you have any idea how much SEIU has spent on lobbying in whatever that time period is?
During that same time,
Whatever that same time period. I want apples to apples.
I'm sure we could create an apples to apples, and I'm sure the state controllers are. I'm sorry.
FPPC.
I'm sorry, Secretary of State could also provide that same information. I do want to highlight with the Corrections Corporation of America that, as Marie had so greatly pointed out, that as we are going through a realignment process and as that legislation has been implemented, I really do have to question why these numbers are still as high as they are. So I want to say, as we are making changes in the way that prisoners are held within the state of California, I don't understand, if we have 33 institutions and we're in California, why that number would need to be so high. That's just a question that I would be asking if I had to look at
think
decisions off of these numbers.
I think that is also a great point, and I would love your help in rolling back AB 109 and that disastrous prison realignment, because our communities are going to be paying the price for that
and we can
very
look at
shortly.
those dollars that are being paid out to a contractor and say, is that the way that services should be delivered in California?
Those are great points. I'm glad to see we agree on 109. Let me ask
Actually,
one last.
I don't agree on 109. I'm just
Oh, maybe you
highlighting
don't want to
the
roll it
fact
back.
that there
I
is
do.
a reduction.
Let me ask one more quick set of questions here, and I guess this is perhaps more. Well, let me ask. Nobody offered to testify who's sitting in the room today from any of these 25 vendors. Can I at least get a show of hand? Is there anyone here representing any of those vendors, just to hear what we have to say? Huh. Might any of them have been invited to testify and declined?
Certainly been posted for some time.
I understand that. Were any of them specifically
I did have a
invited?
couple IT people come talk to me, but I felt we'd probably have a 4 or 5 hour meeting if we delved into IT in addition to the personnel services. So I wanted to focus more on that side of the
No, I appreciate that. I just personally would like to have heard from some of the vendors as to, frankly, the flip side of contracting out. Okay, nothing further. Thank you.
One thing I should tell you, we just gave you this report that contained this information. So this is recently released information. And then since some of these corporations are spending lobbying dollars, maybe there are some people around here that have spoke to them.
Member Allen, do you have some questions?
Just a few.
Okay.
Just a few. So I guess,
too, but it's worth asking them all.
Yeah. I think one thing that would be helpful is that when so much time and effort is put into these reports, it would be good to get a response to the reports made. I think it's not only courtesy, but I think it helps us in terms of if a report is given to us, what your opinion, determination is, whether you think the numbers are accurate, inaccurate, other factors we should be looking at. So I would make a formal request for that. I just think it would be helpful.
We didn't get a copy of these current reports, so we would be more than happy to do that if we get a copy of it.
Yeah, that's very understandable to me. And I didn't mean it as a criticism, but more as a suggestion. So your point is well taken. I guess one thing that came up very early in the hearing was this whole thing about the 80% win rate. Well, what are we talking about in total numbers of appeals and how many things appeared before the SPB over what period of time?
So we have, I believe it's somewhere around 100 different contracts.
Okay.
Around 100 different contracts. And the reason why the win rate isn't higher is because by the time it goes through that administrative process, some of the contracts have expired, or they have re-let the contract under a different name. And so that is why the win rate is not higher, but it's about 100%, around 100 different contracts that have gone forward
Over what
under
time
this
period?
review. Since I think we started challenging them pretty aggressively around 2005, 2006 maybe. But
just trying to get a sense.
it is a job and a
Right.
resource that we have to go through in order to get them in front of the State Personnel Board.
Right. No, so that's helpful. I guess one thing that, and maybe this is something where the chair can help me with or others, is that I think it would be helpful if we could get the data, and I don't know where this data resides in terms of the statement that was made. I'm very concerned, for instance, when you talk about 40 psychiatrists at Atascadero, and they've been there for years, and they're permatemps, and essentially we're open to a charge somewhere down the road that we should have been paying benefits and pensions. So I would like some data as to how many temporary employees do we have that have worked longer than 2 or 3 years that are in place now. I think that'd be useful information to have.
And I don't know if Dr. Busey would be able to provide that for his work group, but I can tell you from some of the challenges that we have with the lack of transparency, we don't necessarily have a name by name. That information is not provided to us. In some contracts, when we actually get them, they don't always hand them over. It could have a name by name, but to compile something and be able to give you a report from SCIU would be very, very difficult because they don't provide the names to us generally.
Yeah, not so much in his name. It's just if we have permatemps, then the numbers would be helpful even at this point. But anyway, I understand it's a resource issue too, because you're trying to enforce something where essentially it takes a lot of resources to look at it, and part of your presentation today is regarding the lack of transparency, the lack of getting data or getting data that's usable. So I understand that.
I think there's going to have to be some sort of stand taken. Let these guys go on. We had people before the Department of Corrections and Mental Health started reducing the hourly rate of contract. There were astronomical rates for psychiatry. They'd fly in from Hawaii, go to Aspen, then come in and do their work here. It was obscene. And thank God that this is being reduced now. But, if the recession lifts and times goes back and the ease of this contracting comes back, I think there's got to have to be a philosophical statement made to people who are taking advantage of this contracting out that after a while, decide what you are. You're taking a lot of resources out of our state and you're doing it at your own leisure. It's convenient. But the civil servants who are working with them, they have to take the call. You can imagine the morale of somebody who's getting paid a half of what the contractors are going to pay. This applies to everyone in every union here. I think, you can speak to that, and I work, Department of Social Services, people who are making more than you and who are coming when and whenever they want and who don't have the full, panoply of what you have to do as a doctor. It's not a good, business practice. It's not a good environment. And the state should say, after a while, make up your mind. What are you? You seem like you like it here. Turn it into an employee, or it's time for you to turn into an employee. You've had it. You've had enough of the state's resources. So, that is one of my solutions here. I think you should seriously think about it.
The other thing that I heard in testimony earlier was someone made a statement regarding long-term dependency on certain corporations or groups to provide a service over long periods of time. And I did hear the testimony regarding sometimes the sole source. There's a good reason why it is that, but I think that information would be helpful. And maybe most of these contracts are within the top 25 that we've already been given the information on. But I think that those that don't fit the parameters of what was described as why, and even the ones that are just sole source where they have the particular, whether it's a commodity or a service, it would be good to know that where we have these 10, 15, 20-year contracts, because it would be good that just not looking at it discretely as a contract, but just on the issue of, is it a good thing to have dependency or sole source on one thing for the state, and whether it should be open up for competitive bid after a certain time is a useful exercise. And just the last comment is that, one thing that I guess members of this committee could do individually or as a group is to send a transmittal memo to the budget committee just asking that maybe the contract costs be somehow displayed in the budget process, because you're right, a lot of times the savings are described as positions and people being either by attrition being laid off or eliminated. And we don't talk a lot about the budget about the contract services, so that might be a useful suggestion. So I thank all of you for your attendance today and your participation.
Thank you. I have my questions down. And let me just start by saying that, I believe there's a place for contracting out. There are times when you have a significant backload in your work, and by contracting out, you can get through that backload, and you may not need a higher level of staffing on a long term. There are times when you have very specialized services, and it may not make sense to have someone with those services on your staff when you only need them for a very specific project. In general, though, and this relates to my 18 years on the school board, I have found that whenever we brought contracted services back into our district, we saved money and provided a higher level of service to the students and the constituents that we served. And I could give you a number of examples where we acted to do that. One of the things that's entered my mind as I've heard all of this is the need for more performance-based budgeting, which I know we all voted on last year. But there doesn't seem to be an effective way of evaluating what is the best way to deliver services to the people of California. And so I have a few questions that I want to ask. I may make a few more comments. But I believe, Mr. Nancho, you said that most of the reasons cited for contracting out fell into your a 19130B either 3 or 10? Do you know? I mean, and 10 is a pretty general area. So do you know what percentage falls into those two categories versus the other 8?
I would say the majority, that may not be fair to say. We see 19130 justifications in all 10 areas, literally.
Okay.
There aren't any exclusive categories that are left out, or there aren't ones that are there. We'll see more of the 3s and 10s than others, but I can't say what percentage it would be.
Okay. And do you know what percentage of the contracts are denied or returned by DGS?
Overall, or specifically on 19130 issues?
Well, overall.
I wouldn't be able to give you an exact amount. I can just kind of tell you, just from my anecdotal knowledge as a second-level reviewer, probably I'd say at least in excess of 15% of the contracts will be returned for one reason or another.
And what percentage of those then come back with modification and have subsequent approval?
I'd say probably a majority of those, probably in the neighborhood of, again, I'm giving you rough numbers and estimates, but probably in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of those will come back with corrections and will ultimately.
So then probably 93 to 95% of the contracts then ultimately are approved by DGS.
Yeah. But one point to note: we do take our contract reviews seriously. I have seen contracts that have been returned to the agency. I think the highest number I personally saw was 7 times before it finally was corrected and approved. But so we will not take the first answer if it's not sufficient.
So I'm just curious in terms of you see it before the personnel board sees it. So is there a reason we don't do it the opposite way, with having someone at the personnel board saying, yes, this is a valid reason before we actually give the contract to you to process it? Is that the best way or not? Or
I couldn't say that's just the way the statutory scheme is set up. Again, with the service contracts, the important thing to remember is the contracts are actually, unlike IT or commodities where DGS is approving those or gives a delegation to an agency to do it. These contracts are actually entered into, they're competitively bid, they're entered into by the contracting agencies. We're approving it, they're not valid until we approve it, but we're approving it just to make sure it complies with appropriate laws. We take what the contracting agency presents to us as information and justification. It's kind of up, if there is a serious problem with the 19130 justification they're giving us, it's kind of up to the unions at that point to get involved and take those to SPB. So I believe that's the way the system has evolved, if you will.
So does that not, I have seen personnel situations where you sort of lose track of all position control. Because if you have, a certain number of positions that are approved, your approved complement, and then you have unlimited access to hire contracted employees, and there's no way of providing those controls, where does that happen? Where is that control process? You're just looking at the contract and you're saying, yes, it meets the criteria, or no, it doesn't. But who's actually taking a look at the overall staffing and which staffing makes sense and what's the most effective way to accomplish that goal?
It's the agencies themselves, and I think it's important to remember that these agencies are staffed by people like you and me. These are good, honest, hardworking people. They're members of unions many times, and they're represented, and they have a desire to do the right thing. I think unless you presume that somehow they're intent on evading the law or circumventing controls, which I'm sure happens from time to time, but I'd like to assume that the majority of these people are doing the right thing and that we can rely upon them to keep the law.
I don't question the motives of anybody, but you also expect that you're doing some kind of cost-benefit analysis to what you're doing. I heard many examples from many different agencies when we were in the middle of furloughs that, the way that these agencies got around furloughs was they went and they had contracts to hire employees. That I don't think is necessarily the most effective way to deliver services. when I was chairing a budget sub in the middle of the furloughs, I would get requests to add new positions from the Department of Finance, but we were still furloughing the existing people. So for those people in the new positions, we had to incur the cost of hiring, training, everything else, and we had people who were cut back and weren't working full time. So I don't question the motives. I do question the process in determining what is the most effective way to deliver services. I mean, if you had people that were constantly working overtime, I would be asking the question, should we have all this overtime, or should we hire more employees to get it done in a most cost-effective manner? So that's why I asked the question, not in terms of, are we solely doing it as, I don't want to say an end run around the budget, which, I mean, if I were running a department and I knew I had a whole lot of work to do and I couldn't add more staff, I can't say I wouldn't be looking at that, even with, all the best intentions of the world, but it may not be the most cost-effective way to deliver that service. And that's, I think, the heart of what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah. And that's absolutely correct. And ultimately, as much as we'd like to, we at DGS, we're not in DMH, we're not in CDCR, we're not in these different agencies. So we don't, we have to rely on their expertise in the business that they do to tell us their justification for the contract that's in front of us.
And so what kind of financial analysis do you go through with your justification? Are you strictly looking at, these categories here? Or is there any kind of financial analysis at all that's done?
Not unless it's claimed under 19130A, which is a cost savings, and then there is.
And those go directly to SPV.
And what percent then are approved under cost savings?
Yeah. It's very, very rare.
So if most of them are not approved under cost savings, how do we know whether or not the personnel services contract is actually resulting in us doing our job in the most cost-effective manner?
Well, again, by definition, they're not being contracted out for cost savings purposes. There's some other requirement. So I don't think that there's, just on the face of it, you wouldn't presume that it's somehow cost beneficial to contract out under 19130B.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
If there was cost savings, it would be under A. And I can't remember the last time we got a 19130A contract in our shop.
So when we have a category like 10 that says urgent, temporary, or occasional services, when civil service delay would frustrate the purpose, those contracts, how often are those contracts extended? They can go up to 9 months. Do you have any idea what percentage of those contracts are extended?
I don't know.
I don't know. I can't think of any offhand, any circumstances that I've approved where they've been extended. I'm sure that there are situations. We literally look at contracts on an individual basis. So it has to have some sort of justification as to why either that's continuing or that's come up again or what have you.
Okay, because it seems to me at some point in time you need to say, okay, if you're continuing to have a contract services, someone's got to do some kind of cost-benefit analysis. I do have a question on the court case that said this contractor is entitled to PERS.
Niedenhauer, yeah.
Right. Did that employee pay into PERS?
No, I think that, yeah, I can't be 100% sure whether he did or not. I have to find that. I will find that out for you, but I don't think, I am not sure.
And then I assume that the state probably didn't pay into PERS.
No, but they're, you can imagine we get 18% retirement from,
right.
Taking the Atascadero example, you'd have, these guys have been there for 5 or 10 years coming on full time. You have a tremendous amount of money that the state would owe them if they won their case and said I was an employee the whole time.
And does the state then have a right to go back and collect the PERS? I mean, it seems to me that, that's a huge liability if we are risking a situation where someone can collect retirement for the rest of their lives and they haven't paid in.
Right, the shoe hasn't dropped yet, but I think there was one other, the T-Bird case, what happened in 1970. That was the first shot, but this And you know what? There's another person, I think in one of our other bargaining units that recently, he hasn't asked for service credits, but he is looking at that case and he is asking for something else, and I get you that one too. But this is a more recent thing. People do not know about that. They're pretty happy making their money as contractors, so they're not going back. But if they decide to go over to our side, become civil servants, they might look at the last 8 years and say, you know what, I've been like this for 8. You owe me a lot more than that. So I mean that's that many times you have these legal possibilities that never happen, and hopefully they won't. But I hope it doesn't get down to Tascadero where those guys have had it pretty good. And I want to just say this when I have the chance here that Mr. Butler said that having putting these contractors in for 9 months or 12 months or 36 months. We're all good, honest people, but we're all human people, and the management at some of these agencies, they enjoy the flexibility of the contractors, and they really they can manipulate them more than civil servants, and they have a little symbiosis there, and they will keep these people on to the expense of a vacant position. So I think there is, it's not something evil or anything, but there's something very convenient about the relationship that sometimes occurs between an management person and a contractor that I feel, and I hear from my members that, Joe here has taken one of my positions, and he's been here a long time. It's not fair. So, I mean, some of the responsibility has to be put on the temptation to have it easy with a contractor, to control them, basically. They don't have the civil service protections and the due process. They're very vulnerable, the contractors, and we have had contractors flip over to civil service just because of that they wanted more due process protection. But while they got that relationship, the administration kind of likes it and wants to keep them on, sometimes at the expense of vacant positions. So I just wanted to put that in. It's not totally benign.
Well, I if I were going to conclude, I think many of my questions here as I go through, we sort of hit on them at one time, in one way or another, and we can talk more. But again, my interest would be in trying to peel the onion a little bit more and get into the basic decision making up front, and not have incentives to contract out if you can hire employees at a lower cost to do the same job. And my experience is that when you have employees of your organization, you have a higher level of commitment, and you have more control over the job than when you pay a contractor. I mean, usually when you're paying contract rates, you're paying twice the going rate, because part of it's going to, some may contract directly, some with agencies, you're paying twice the going rate because some is going to the agency and some is going to the contractor. And I think we need to be sure that we're getting value. And I also think we need to be sure that we don't have statutes that push us into contracting because we don't want to add another position to a department when adding the position is more cost effective. So I think there's certainly the discussion should be continued, but ultimately I think all of our goals are the same, and that's to deliver the highest level of service we can to the constituents of the state of California in the most cost-effective manner. And we need to, I think, have further dialogue on this issue and exactly what controls and what is in place. Because I don't doubt that you're doing your job at DGS, but I want to be sure that all of our managers and our agency heads and others are performing the kind of cost-benefit analysis to make sure that we're making the right decisions, not just with contracting, but as I said, with overtime and in general, because that should be the goal of all of us. So, and if there are any other questions? All right, well, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.